So, comics isn't comics, which is a vaguely ridiculous way of saying that we, and this includes me, although I do try to be aware of when I'm doing it, use the word comics to mean a very specific thing and not actually comics generally. I'm comic book writer Justin Jordan. This is Death or Comics, and I introduce myself that way for the algorithm. All hail our machine gods, I guess. Anyway, if that first thing didn't make sense, give me a minute and I'll explain. But if you'd rather read that explanation than hear me talking about it, or you just like to start creating comics now, then sign up for the Death or Comics newsletter through the link below, and we'll send you our quick start guides to writing, pitching, and comic book script format. One of the most useful questions you can ask is, what do you mean by that? When I use the word comics, casually, I usually don't mean sequential storytelling through a series of still images or whatever. What I mean by that is, more or less, the direct comics market. Floppies and trades sold through comic book specialty shops. And that matters because in this case, thinking about comics primarily as that shapes how I, and honestly, a lot of other people, think about them, in ways that give a false view of what comics actually are. And this is a very US-centric view of it because comics, see I'm doing it again, work differently here than they do in many other places. And because I'm largely writing towards an English-speaking audience in these videos, in Japan or France or South America, this video will not apply. So consider that a caveat. But in the US, we tend to give a lot of weight to direct market comics, and specifically, superhero comics. There's a very good chance if you're listening to this, if I talk about comics, you're thinking of Marvel and DC and their respective pantheons. Which, to be fair, for a variety of reasons, the direct market, and I have a whole video on that, is actually dominated by Marvel and DC. And they also have an outsized cultural influence generally through movies, television, and whatnot. So, not surprising that that's what we all think of. But it's also not what comics is. In the US, there are roughly 4 mostly separate comics markets, and of these, the one with the fewest readers, and maybe the lowest amount of money flowing through it, is actually the direct market. My second caveat is that I'm dividing these markets in my own idiosyncratic way of defining them, which is not the same as how an economics textbook would, probably. Okay, look, I never actually took economics in college, so whatever. But this is a mix of readership, sales outlets, reader expectations, and, let's be honest, vibes. The biggest market is probably webcomics. The major players in that market get millions of readers, and there are a lot of series. By way of a for instance, Urban Animal, the comic I do at Webtoon with my buddy John Amore, has about 500,000 subscribers and something like 32 million reads as I prepare this video. And while I absolutely am flexing, I do want to note that by Webtoon standards, this is kind of a mid-level series. The big dogs, like Lore Olympus, they get vastly more. As an even bigger flex, this is not actually the most read comic that I wrote. That would be the couple of years when I was writing a comic that was readable in an app for Call of Duty Mobile, which had, a lot of readers. Now, I could see you flocking to the comments section to point out that, aha, webcomics are free. This is not an apples-apples comparison, you gormless mediocre hack. And you would be correct, not about the gormless mediocre hack thing, although, who knows. But this will not be my only market that is free to the user. But I do want to note that many webcomics do actually have a way to pay their creators, even ignoring any ad-driven content. Webtoons, for instance, has FastPass, which allows you to read episodes early. And I can tell you from my Urban Animal experience, it's not a trivial amount of money. And that even if you just confine webcomics to people who pay in some way to read them, it's still a lot of people by the standards of the direct market. The next is the bookstore and library market, which, yes, I am counting as one, and yes, part of which is also free to the user. The reason that I combine them, it's kind of the same audience reading the same kind of books, which is a relevant bit of how I'm dividing these markets up. Honestly, you can just call them readerships if that makes you happy. The big dog, as it were, right now in the market is Dave Pilkey, who writes the Dogman books. They are absolutely comic books. And the initial print run for the last one was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 million copies. And that's just one author in that market. For comparison, a graphic novel selling 50,000 copies in a year would be a massive, gigantic monster of a seller in a direct market. And while that would still be great sales in the bookstore and library market, it's not the outlier number it would be in the direct market. There is some overlap with the direct market here, too. Watchmen, for instance, is a direct market book from a direct market publisher, from creators who have worked in the direct market for decades. But it sells a lot in bookstores and, relevantly to my definition, sells a lot to people who don't go into comic book stores. And yeah, also some overlap with webcomics, which were often collected and sold. Don't worry, I'm actually going to get into the overlap and why I'm doing this way and what my actual, point is. But first, manga, which was, just waiting there for us. It overlaps with bookstores, libraries, and webcomics. This is, obviously, imported Japanese comics, and oh boy, there are a lot of them. You can wander into your nearest Barnes & Noble or other chain, but are there other chains? And just compare the size of the graphic novel section to the manga section. So the obvious question is that if these markets are more about readership and there's overlap, why talk about them as being distinct things at all? Well, partly because if you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice that I didn't really mention the direct market crossing over. And for the most part, it doesn't. Which, if you work in and love the direct market and the kinds of comics you get there, is an issue. I can't decide if I use the word issue there as a pun or not. You decide and let me know in the comments and tell me about that Gormless hack thing, I suppose. There's some overlap in terms of actual sales with bookstores and libraries, and Marvel and DC do have webcomics lines. Actually, as I write this, Marvel just announced a deal with Webtoons, but for the most part, there's not a huge overlap of readers. People who are reading direct market comics are typically not reading webcomics or manga or the kind of thing that we looked at as the bookstore market. And likewise, the people who read those other markets have varying degrees of overlap, but honestly not as much as you would think. The bookstore and library market tends to be dominated by middle grade, trending to young adult, and a small selection of adult classics. In the latter case, think stuff like Persepolis and Mouse and even Watchmen. Manga tends to skew to teens and people in their 20s, although it's been established long enough now that a fair few of those readers are now in their 30s. But right now, the market as a whole skews younger and more diverse than the direct market does. More women, more people of color. Webcomics, actually, has a fairly similar audience. I would say webcomics and manga probably have the biggest overlap in readership, but even then, they're not quite the same people. And webcomics will generally tend to skew a lot more towards women. The net of all this is that people always talk comics are dying, which I've been hearing since at least the early 90s. And even in just the direct market, that's probably not true, and pretty crucially, comics is bigger than the direct market, much bigger, and the direct market is probably the smallest chunk. A lot of people like and read comics. Very few of them, relatively, are going into the 2,000 odd comic shops in the US. And this matters because I want you to think about what you, as a creator, mean by, I want to make comics. Is it just direct market stuff? Or do you not care how it comes out? Or do you want to do it all, like I kind of do, and kind of have? The other reason I bring this up is because, on a purely mercenary level, looking at the larger picture can make the difference between spending money to make comics and comics making you money. Which, that's not nothing. You, the writer, may have spare time to write, but the art team has to really invest time, so it'd be great for that to pay off for them. And obviously, there are other ways to look at the markets. For instance, I could see an argument that crowdfunded comics are a fifth market, and honestly, that is worth considering. But regardless, think about what you mean when you say comics can have real and practical benefits when you're trying to make comics. What also has a real and practical effect, if you've made it this far, is liking and subscribing, which happily are also free. You could also watch another video, sign up for the mailing list prize below, or recommend us to a friend. Hey, or all of them. Go wild. Go buck wild.